Welcome back. Shabbat Shalom continued. Welcome back, brethren. We are going to continue our study that we left off in Genesis chapter 10. This is part 2 of the Genesis chapter 10, the origin of all nations study. We started and we went back and did some preliminary things in terms of history, in terms of peoples of history, what the battle, if you will, the war on earth, spiritual war is all about. It's about the peoples that come from Shem through Jacob as the father Yah, the creator's chosen seed. And it comes versus Asatan and all the peoples that are followers of his man-made religious systems. Because you have man-made religious systems, and then you have a nation chosen by the Father Yah. You have man-made religious systems, and you have a nation chosen by Father Yah. You know, this reminds me, back in the 80s, there was a documentary series in the 80s, and I believe it still exists. I have parts of it saved, but I believe it still exists. It was called Eyes on the Prize. There was a documentary series, and what it was doing was doing a documentary on the history of the so-called civil rights movement. I say so-called civil rights movement. And it started in the 1950s, the documentary, with historical breakdowns from the 1950s, with the separate but equal doctrine challenged by Thurgood Marshall in the Supreme Court. All the way it went into the 1980s, where Chicago elected its first Black mayor. And so it chronicled the 50s, the 60s, especially a lot of in the 60s, and then the 70s, and finally the 80s of the so-called civil rights movement. I say so-called because what the civil rights movement really was about, when you actually look at it now that we're looking in the past, if you take away all the glorifying of all of that, of the so-called people of the civil rights movement was defined by Malcolm X very well. Civil rights movement gave you the right to sit on the toilet next to a white man. That's what it did. Civil rights movement gave you the opportunity to spend your hard-earned dollars in Caucasian-owned establishments. That's what it did. Okay? That's really what the accomplishment was. You could sit in a bus station next to Caucasian people, the children of your faith. You can sit on a bus anywhere you wanted to on the bus. So people bled to death, were bleeding, churches were bombed, people were murdered, so that we, Hebrews, could sit anywhere we wanted to on a bus. Or we can go to the same toilet as the children of your faith. That's what it accomplished. Somebody said, well, we can vote. Can we? They've realigned the districts so that our votes don't even matter. So I say it was a so-called civil rights movement. What we really needed, which is why Malcolm X was murdered, what we really needed was a revolution, a human rights revolution. And Malcolm X was planning on taking the human rights violations of the United States to the UN. And before he could get there, he was murdered. So this so-called civil rights movement, really what it showed, and in that documentary, Eyes on the Prize, there's a song, a theme song of it, and it goes, the one thing we did right was the day we started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hence, the name of the documentary is called Eyes on the Prize. The one thing we did right was the day we started to fight. And keep your eyes on the prize. And so what it showed was, even though it was controlled by money from wealthy Caucasian people, just like Black Lives Matter is today, just like Black Lives Matter is today, just like Black Lives Matter is today. It was controlled by money from wealthy Caucasian people to control a movement for their political aims, not our gain, for the political aims of the established ruling class. That's what that was. Okay? Just like Black Lives Matter is today. That's right. A false flag movement, basically. So the real revolution, as we said, Messiah is going to bring a real revolution as the Bible describes it. And when he does, there's going to be a permanent, eternal change. And that's coming very shortly. But my reason for bringing this up was during the course of this so-called movement. In the 1970s, there was a meeting in Gary, Indiana. And the meeting was I'm not even sure what the purpose of the meeting was, but there were so-called Black leaders from across the country that came to this meeting in Gary, Indiana. People came from all over the country in busloads to meet in Gary, Indiana. Gary, Indiana has traditionally been, a red-lined, mostly so-called Black city. Of course, it also has some of the highest crime rates, drug rates in the nation. It's a suburb of Chicago. Okay, so they met in Gary, Indiana. Okay. And what happened during the course, it was a couple of days, this meeting. I don't remember exactly how long it was, but it was at least a couple of days, this meeting, these group series of meetings. And you had different Black leaders, stand up and talk, at different parts of these meetings. I don't know if Stokely Carmichael was there. Then he wasn't known as Kwame Ture yet. And then there were other people, poets, rappers, a poet named Bakari was there, that would do poetry, and different people were there. And of course, Black leader meeting in the United States wouldn't be complete without Jesse Jackson. So Jesse Jackson was there. And Jesse Jackson gave, I guess you would call it, the keynote speech of the meeting. Okay. And this is typical of not only meetings of false Black movements in the United States, but it's typical of so-called Black church. I'll explain. Most of his speech had to do with him saying and re-saying these two words. And he kept saying it and repeating it. And brethren, that's what people do in churches. They don't really teach you. And y'all could bear witness. When you're in churches, you don't really get taught the word of the Most High. You get brainwashed. And part of the brainwashing is repeating or chanting. If you notice that, y'all notice that? They'll use a verse, or they'll use part of a verse, or they'll use a term, and they'll continue to repeat it. It's just like reverberating. Like I remember once there was a choir in the church I used to belong to, and they were talking about, they just kept chanting the word Joshua, Joshua. And they just kept it, and there was no meaning behind it. They just kept chanting it. Okay. And so I've seen them do this on a lot of churches when I was in the Seventh-day Adventist church. And of course, in the Sunday churches is big time. And people get all emotional about the chanting they've done. And they think that something's happened. Something positive has happened. Well, something did happen. They just got brainwashed. Okay. They just got brainwashed. That's part of it. So you chanting or refraining something and you just keep doing it, and you don't even know what it means. And especially this works among so-called Black people, because we are a people, and I don't think I'm saying anything earth-shattering here. We're a people of rhythm and spirit. We are people of rhythm and spirit. So if you could, and the Catholic Church has learned how to control certain groups of people by certain character traits. So in other words, they had a hard time infiltrating the Pentecostal church. That's what the Jesuit priest said. He said, but what they did is they decided to take on the Catholic charismatic movement and talk about the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And that's how they got the Catholics on board with them. And depending on what they were trying to infiltrate, they would take on character traits of the group they're trying to infiltrate. Well, in terms of Black church, it is rhythm. If you can get into a musical rhythm or refrain, it almost doesn't matter what you're saying. You can catch all of the people and make them leave believing that, you know, someone would say like this. Have you ever heard this term? Jesus showed up and showed out. Have you ever heard that before? Jesus showed up and showed out today. And all they did was chant. Okay, all they did was chant. Well, at this meeting in Gary, Indiana, Jesse Jackson stood up and he was saying nation time. He said, it's nation time, nation time. And the whole crowd, I can't tell you how many hundreds or thousands of people was in that auditorium that day. Like I said, they came from all over the country, and it was a full. Let's say there was at least 5,000 people there, maybe 10, and they were all chanting nation time, nation time. And then he acted like he was walking away like James Brown used to do. And James Brown used to, some of y'all remember James Brown, and they put the cape on him and he acted like he's going away. Then he come back. Well, Jesse Jackson did that. He acted like he was going to sit down. Then he came back to the mic and he said, what time is it? And everybody said, nation time. And then he sat down and everybody was clapping and going crazy. Nobody explained what nation time meant. Nobody explained what was he talking about. I listened to the whole thing. Like, I listened to civil rights stuff religiously, like I said, but what was nation time? What's that? What did it mean? He never explained it. He just said it's nation time. You see, it was about mind control. But the term nation time, little did the raccoon realize that with the awakening, it is nation time, isn't it? Isn't it? When you think about it, as Hebrews that are awakening, it is nation time. What nation? The scattered nation of Israel. It's time for us to awake. And we are awakening. That's the real nation time. Right? And so that nation is what differentiates us, one of the ways, from everybody else on the planet, because we're not following a religion, brethren. We are following the God of a nation that was chosen by the Creator and named, not just chosen. He not only chose us, he said we are the people called by his name. What does that mean, his name? That means a name he gave us. It's his. Israel is his name. We're the people called by his name. Abraham was called by his father, Terah, Abraham. But father said, your name's not Abraham anymore. Abraham is your name. He was called by the father's name. He had a son. Messiah came and visited him a year before his wife had the son and said, you're going to have a son. And she laughed and said, I'm going to have pleasure. My Lord going to have pleasure. And he laughed. Oh, may Israel live before you. And he said, you laughing, huh? Your son's name is to laugh. Yisha'ak, called by his name. Yisha'ak had twin sons. First one was all hairy, Edom, or Adam. Really, Adam is the same name, Edom. Hairy, Adam. But then the other one, they called him Jacob because he grabbed Adam by the heel. But the father said, your name's not Jacob anymore. Your name's Israel. He's called by the father's name. And his nation was called by that name. A nation chosen by the Father. And yes, as we are now awakening, really is nation time, isn't it? So that when we're looking here at the table of nations, there's one nation that came out of these people that's going to be the nation that leads the kingdom of the Father. That's going to be the chosen nation of the capital city of the earth. and it ain't Washington, D.C. And so as we're getting prepared to live in that kingdom and to help others from all over the earth live in that kingdom, indeed, it's nation time. Genesis chapter 10, we did already the children of Japhet. You might notice it says Japhet, J-A-P-H-E-T-H, Japhet. But why do I say Japhet? Well, most of you all know, but let me explain for those that may not know. In the Hebrew and in the original King James, there was no such thing as the letter J. The letter J did not exist in 1611. And any subsequent time previous, it did not exist. There was no letter J. That's a new letter. I mean, historically speaking, if you're talking about 6,000 years of history, and we're talking about from sometime after 1611, so you're talking about sometime in the last, let's say, 400 years, this letter J came about. That did not exist until about 400, let's give it 500 years ago. Did not exist. So the letter J didn't exist. Instead, what was the original sound was what we call a Y sound. Yah. They say the yod. That's what really existed. So when I say Japhet, that's more closely aligned with probably how you say the name than Japhet, because there was no J, which is the reason also we know, not guess, know that the Messiah's name could not have been Jesus. They used Jesus when they invented the J. But if you look at the original King James, his name is given Jesus. That's his original name given by Tyndale, and by those of the English, they used Jesus because there was no J for them to know about. No J. And Jesus more accurately describes what a Greek would call him, who understood Zeus being a god. Yah Zeus. Now, that doesn't make the New Testament a lie. It's still true. But they're giving you what they understood at the time. So what does that mean? As Yah's children are awakening to the new nation, we are also awakening to things like that. The real name of the Messiah. Okay? It's not because we're smart or because we have academic excellence. It's because of the Spirit of the Father awakening us to the Messiah. Using the same Bible. Same one. So we went through the children of Japhet. First 5 verses of chapter 10. And next is going to be the middle child, Ham. The middle child, Ham. Okay? So you had Shem, Ham, Japhet. The oldest is Shem, the middle child is Ham, the youngest is Japhet. He went through the youngest one first, Japhet. Now he's going to go through Ham, the middle child. And he's going to give us the nations that came from the loins of Ham. Let's start in verse 6. This is Genesis chapter 10, beginning at verse 6. And I'm going to go from verse 6 down to verse 20. From verse 6 down to verse 20. And there's a lot here because the Hamitic people for the second phase of 2,000 years of Earth's history. So the first 2,000 years ended with Noah. The second phase of 2,000 years came after the flood. And so that second phase of 2,000 years, until the end of that phase, it was Hamitic nations dominating the earth, the Assyrians, the Egyptians or Mizraim, Cush, all of these dominating the earth from Ham at the time. And then you had, of course, the Greek nations, which were Yavan, and then you had Yavan, and you had Tarshish and Kittim, which became your Romans and your Cyprus. That came from Japhet. And so the last 2,000 years, Japhet has been the dominant nation. And we pointed out the 1,000 years of messianic reign that's about to take place in the next few years, about to begin, that's Shem. Dominant. Shem. Okay. And it's going to be Shem forever. Okay. So that's how it ends up. But for the first 2,000 years, it was the flood. Before the flood, Adam. Then the second 2,000 years, Ham. The third 2,000 years, Japhet. The last brother that's going to get all the blessings, and from them the blessings flow, from which Messiah flows, Shem. Okay, so let's go now. Genesis chapter 10, beginning at verse 6. And the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. So Ham had 4 sons. The oldest one, Cush, which we now call Ethiopia. Mizraim, which the Greeks changed to Egypt. Put, which is also Africa. And Canaan, which is what we call, not what we call, but what people call, what the world calls today, the Middle East. But really, before they created the Suez Canal, it was one land with what we call Africa. Y'all understand that? So the Suez Canal divided the land. But before the Suez Canal, it was all one land, Africa. The whole continent was with what we call now the Middle East, which is a strange name, isn't it? Middle East, right? Generally, you have north, south, east, and west. So they created this other thing so that they can try to distinguish Africa from where Japhet took over and went into the tents of Shem. And they call it Middle East. But we praise the Most High for the original nation so we can see where everybody came from. Okay? So here, Ham had Cush, his firstborn, Mizraim, Put, which is North Africa, and Canaan. This is the origin of dark peoples. Dark peoples. Dark brown peoples. Here. Okay? And they're closely aligned, as you will see, with Shem. Closely aligned. Let's continue. Verse 7. And the sons of Cush, Sheba, Havilah, Sabta, Ra'amah, Sabtika. And the sons of Ra'amah, Sheba, and Dedan. So the queen of Sheba that came to Solomon was what we would call today African. And she is a Cushite, Ethiopian, which even today, Ethiopians will tell you, or they'll claim, that the Queen of Sheba had a child with Solomon, and that the descendants came all the way to Haile Selassie, an emperor of Ethiopia. And they say Haile Selassie, and they'll tell you to this day, they have a flag, they have a symbol where you have a cross and you have a lion. What is the lion for? Judah in Cush. And even the Ashkenazis could not deny that, because when it was pointed out through the whole earth, said that these people came from Shem, they started allowing them to come into the land of the state of Israel. Of course, by and large, they're discriminated against, just like we are everywhere. Okay, but there you go. Verse 8. So Cush had Sheba, Havilah, Sabta, Ra'amah, Sabtika, and then he got a 6th son, Nimrod. And Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. So now you have Cush, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. So that now Nimrod is a world-renowned individual. As you're about to see, he's the first major emperor of planet Earth, the first world ruler. after the flood. Nimrod. From Ham. From Ethiopia, from Cush. Nimrod. Okay. Verse 9. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. When they say before Yahweh, that means instead of Yahweh. He was worshipped. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before Yahweh, and the beginning of his kingdom, notice, Nimrod had a kingdom. This is the first time in the Bible that somebody is recorded as having a kingdom. Do y'all notice that? And where is it coming from? Cush. So the first world kingdom was from Ham. Okay, as I mentioned. So the first 2,000, the second 2,000 years of Earth's history was dominated by the Hamitic people. And so here you have, in the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, from where you get Babylon. That's the origin, that's the root of Babylon. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. So when you called Babel the Tower of Babel, guess who was the mighty one, the emperor of that empire? Nimrod. Okay? And Arek and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Do you remember? In the plains of Dura and Shinar, that's where Nebuchadnezzar created the golden statue. Same origins. So, when you think about this, right? If Nebuchadnezzar did that and he was the emperor of Babylon, if you wanted to get an idea of what Nebuchadnezzar looked like, would you think he would look more like, or would he look more closely aligned with, I don't know, Wesley Snipes? Or would he look more like, I don't know, Alexander the Great? Who would Nebuchadnezzar more closely aligned with? Would he look more like Wesley Snipes? Or would he look more like, I don't know, say, Pope? Yeah, he was a Hamite in Babylon. Yes, sir. He'd be more like Demolition Man without the blonde hair. He'd be more like Demolition Man. He would look more like Wesley Snipes than he would look like, say, Tom Cruise, right? He would look more like Wesley Snipes, right? That show you who Nebuchadnezzar was. Okay? All right. So we're seeing it right here, aren't we? I praise the Most High. That's why I say, read your Bible. Look at that. So he was the king of Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, Shinar. Out of that land went forth Ashur. Ashur is where you get Assyria. Ashur is from Assyrian. That's Assyrian. Okay, in Nimrod's land. Okay, Nineveh. That's who Jonah was told to go warn, right? Go warn Nineveh. Go warn them Africans. Warn them Hamites. And Jonah said, I ain't warning no Hamites. I'd rather get thrown into the sea. Go warn them Hamites. Nineveh. In the city of Rehoboth and Calah. Okay. Verse 12. And Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, the same as a great city. So you can see the Hamites built kingdoms and great cities. You ain't hear nothing like that when we just read through Yefet, did you? You ain't hear nothing like that. Great cities. Kingdoms. Ham. Okay? And Mizraim, verse 13, begot Ludim and Anamim and Lahabim and Naphtuim. Wait, verse 14. And Pathrusim and Calusim, out of whom came Philistine. So, when the land of Canaan was inhabited, you had children of Canaan, obviously, but there was one group of people that wasn't from Canaan. They was from Cush. Who were those people? Philistines. Look at that. So you have Philistines that were from that weren't from Canaan. They weren't Canaanites. Philistines were from Nimrod. And they were from Mizraim, which is Egypt. They were really from Ham. So all of them were from Ham, but Philistine was different from the rest of the folks that was in Canaan. Philistine came from Mizraim. They were related to what later became Egypt. African. And Philistine, brethren, if you look up the word Philistine in the Hebrew, you will find it is Palestine. Palestine. That's the whole land called Palestine. And Palestine, therefore, was from Ham, from Mizraim, one of the sons of Ham. Look at that. Look at that. Now, let's keep going. Verse 15. And Canaan, this is whose land it was, begot Sidon. Where we hear that from? Remember the lady that came to the Messiah from Tyre and Sidon and said, please help my child? And he said, it is not meet to give the children's bread and feed it to the dogs. That was a child of Canaan, who is a child of Ham. And the firstborn, Heth, and the Jebusite. Where did you hear Jebusite before? Jebusites were the builders of the city of Jerusalem. They built Jerusalem. Jebus was the first inhabitants of Jerusalem. Jerusalem wasn't built by the Hebrews. It was built by the children of Ham. See? You see how this goes now? That is why, brethren, there's going to be a new Jerusalem. There's going to be a new Jerusalem built without human hands by Father Yah. That's why Messiah said, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. That new place, and I saw New Jerusalem coming down from heaven from the Father. So this place called Jerusalem was named Jerusalem now. It was named by the Hebrews Jerusalem. But at first it was called Jebus. The same city. It was called Jebus because it was founded and built by the Jebusites, who were children of Canaan. David is the one that took Canaan, that took Jebus. David fought and he called it the city of David in Zion. David took that. He had to fight against the Jebusites to take it. And he did. Okay. He promised, whoever takes it, I'm going to give them one of my daughters to wife or something like that. Let's give them a wife. And I think it was Joab, who became the general. He took it. Joab was actually David's cousin. But anyway, yes. And the Amorite, the Girgasite, the Hivite, the Archite, the Sinite, and the Arvadite, and the Zemarite, and the Amathite, and after were the families of the Canaanites spread abroad. And the border of Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gerar, unto Gaza, that's close to Egypt, as thou goest to Sodom and Gomorrah, and Admah, and Zeboim, and Lasha. These are the sons of Ham, after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and their nations. These are the sons of Ham. Notice, just notice that when you had the nations of Japhet, he said, by these were the isles of the Gentiles. He didn't use that term here with Ham. He just said, these are the sons of Ham, after their families, their tongue, and their nation. Why is that? I'm not saying that people that were of Ham can't be Gentiles. What I'm saying, though, is the Father, in this word, when Moses wrote it, he didn't use Gentiles to describe them. And one of the reasons could be is that them and Shem lived in the same land. You see, they were intermingled. There wasn't a lot of intermingling with Japhet. Japhet was from the north. Later on, when the Greeks came, the Greeks started mingling their seed with Ham and Shem. But initially, the first 2,000 years, Japhet was in the north and Shem and Ham were in the south. And their seeds mingled a lot. Okay, a lot. Got me? And now we saw yesterday, as we studied yesterday, you recall, the practices, the things they were doing in the land of Canaan. So all of these nations were practicing perversions, okay, which is why they were displaced from the land. That's why Abraham was promised that land particularly. They didn't tell Abraham, I'm going to give you Cush's land. He didn't tell Abraham, I'm going to give you Put's land. He didn't tell Abraham, I'm going to give you Mizraim's land. He told Abraham, I'm giving you Canaan's land. That's where the promise came to Abraham, to get Canaan's land. And he said, reason I'm going to wait 400 years because their iniquity is not yet full. When their iniquity became full, here come Joshua. And here they come taking over the land. Okay, the land of Canaan. And they had trouble with the brethren that weren't from Canaan, called the Philistines. The Philistines were from Mizraim. They had trouble taking them out. Okay, had trouble taking them out. Raised up Saul. Saul failed. Raised up David. David had it under control until Solomon came and started having all these concubines and wives that weren't from the Most High. And everything got messed up. Praise the Most High. Okay, so now we covered, that's right, Joseph's wife, that's right, had two sons from the Ham. Joseph's wife had two sons from Ham. Moses had sons from Ham. Moses' wife was a Cushite. Y'all know that, right? Moses' wife was a Cushite. Two sons from Ham. There you go. And then you had, of course, Joseph, who had two, not just two sons, not just that. He had two whole tribes of Israel with Hamite woman. Two whole tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, with a Hamite. Okay? They were so intermingled that let me show you. The Bible shows, which we're gonna get to when we study, but when they went to go bury Jacob, they took Jacob back to the land of Canaan. They took Jacob back to the land of Canaan, right? And I want to show you what happened when they took him back to the land of Canaan. And we're going to come back and we're going to cover this as we get closer to the end of Genesis. But notice chapter 50 of Genesis. Watch this now. Chapter 50 of Genesis. Now, all of the 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Jacob, had went into Egypt, Mizraim, and they were given the land of Goshen within Mizraim. They were given this land because they were mostly cattle raisers of beef. Cattle, right? They would call them shepherds. And it was abominable to the Egyptian shepherds. So they gave them this land of Goshen for them to be raising their cattle on. So let's take a look here. Once Jacob died in Genesis chapter 50, let's go start at verse. I'm going to start at verse 7 of Genesis chapter 50. Remember, the original name of Egypt is called Mizraim. Remember that now. Genesis chapter 50, beginning at verse 7. And I'm going to go from verse 7 down to verse 13. And Joseph went up to bury his father. And with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, all the elders of the land of Egypt, and all the house of Joseph and his brethren and his father's house. Only their little ones and their flocks and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. And they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan. And there they mourned with a great and very sore lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning in the floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians." Wherefore the name of it was called Abel Mizraim, or mourning of Mizraim, which is beyond Jordan. And his sons did unto him according as he commanded them. For his sons carried him into the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, which Abraham bought with the field for a possession of a burying place of Ephron the Hittite before Mamre. So the land of Canaan saw a bunch of brothers coming out of Mizraim and said, "Oh, this is a great mourning for one of the great ones of Mizraim," because they couldn't tell the difference between the people of Mizraim and Jacob's children. They couldn't tell the difference between Jacob's children and Mizraim. Jacob's children came to the land of Mizraim to buy food and couldn't tell the difference between their brother Joseph and the rest of the children of Mizraim. Can you imagine? So they're very closely aligned. Now, there is distinction, obviously, but not that much. There's more similarities than distinctions. So much so that in the book of Acts, chapter 21, the book of Acts, chapter 21, let's get another witness. The book of Acts, chapter 21, let's get a witness for the Christian Gentiles that think I'm lying to them, right? In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every word be established. Acts chapter 21. Let's begin at verse, let's see. I'm going to begin at verse 26 and read down to verse 40. Acts chapter 21, from verse 26 to verse 40. This is a witness of the apostle Paul. We just read a witness of Moses, right? The mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every word be established. Acts chapter 21, beginning at verse 26. Then Paul took the men, and next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and against the law, and this place further brought Greeks also into the temple and have polluted this holy place. For they had seen before with him in the city of Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple. Forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, they were going to kill him, tidings came into the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, the band being Roman, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating of Paul. Then the chief captains came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains and demanded who he was and what he had done. So they didn't know who Paul was or what he had done to cause them to try to kill him. To them, they didn't understand. And some cried one thing and some another among the multitude. And when he could not know of the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him, to be carried into the castle. So you can't tell what's going on. Bring him into the castle and let's examine him in there. And when he had came upon the stairs, so it was that he was born of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, away with him. And as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, may I speak unto thee? Who said, canst thou speak Greek? So Paul started to speak Greek to the captain of the Roman centurion. And the Roman centurion was surprised. He said, can you speak Greek? Verse 38. The centurion continues. Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days made us an uproar and led us out into the wilderness, 4,000 men that were murderers? So he looked at Paul. He was surprised. This man can speak Greek. And he said, hey, look, aren't you that Egyptian? So he looked at Paul, didn't know who he was, but from his appearance, he surmised this must be that Egyptian they're talking about. So what do you suppose about Paul's appearance made him look like he was from Mizraim? What do you suppose about Paul's appearance that made this man who didn't know who he was surprised he could speak Greek, and asked him, are you from Mizraim? I think it must have been something about that melanin in his skin. He must have had a level of melanin that told the Greek, this man must be from Mizraim. Him. Look at him. But what did Paul say? Verse 39. But Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a city of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people, and there was made a great silence. And he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue. So this dark man that looked like one of the children of Mizraim, who were one of the children of Ham, he was a Hebrew. He was raised in Cilicia, which is a children of Yafet city, but he was a dark man and he was a Hebrew. Why? Because people had already been scattered for many years before that, right? So he was raised in Cilicia with a whole bunch of Hebrews that were there. And he looked like a Hebrew because he also looked like a Hamite, because the Hamites and the Hebrews had a lot in common, apparently. That is why you don't see Moses classifying them as just Gentiles. He said these were the children of Ham, because Shemites and Hamites lived together. Okay, they were mixed in with each other. And so when our fathers left the land of Goshen to come to the promised land, there was a mixture. You can't be, even if you don't believe they were in Egypt for 400 years, and I totally understand that argument, they were in Egypt at least 150, 200 years, if you just go by Joseph's and Moses' lifespan. They were in Egypt for over a century, at least maybe 2 centuries, right? So if you're mixed with a people, you're in with a group of people for 2 centuries, you telling me your bloodlines don't mix? Never? Nobody fall in love? Nobody have sex with somebody else? Come on. So when they were leaving Goshen, if they weren't black before they came in there, if you want to argue they weren't black before they came in there, I can tell you what, they was black when they left. But we are arguing they were born before they even went down, before Jacob and them even went down into Mizraim. They was already black. Before Joseph and them even went down into Mizraim, they was black. Okay? So that the ancient Israelites had an appearance very closely aligned with Hamites. Can we say that? I mean, is that fair? That ancient Israelites' appearance were very closely aligned with Hamitic people. And that there was a distinction made between the Hamitic and the Shem, but also a big distinction with Japhet. So that Japhet is a Greek looking at him and saying, "Oh, wait, who are you? Are you a Hamite?" Okay. So you want to know who the original bloodline Hebrews are? Well, at least you're getting an idea what they look like. Let's continue. Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10. Now, let's move on to the oldest son, Shem. Genesis chapter 10, beginning at verse 21. Verse 21 is very interesting. Watch how it goes. Genesis chapter 10, verse 21. Unto Shem also the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japhet the elder, even to him were children born. Some people think that this verse is saying Japhet is the elder. It's telling you that Shem was the elder. He's the brother of Japhet. He's the elder. He's the oldest. He's the firstborn. Of the triplets, he came out first. That's why they always say Shem, Ham, Japhet. Shem, Ham, Japhet. Everywhere you see them put together, Genesis chapter 10, Genesis chapter 5, Genesis chapter 6 is Shem, Ham, Japhet. Shem, Ham, Japhet. Even when you go to the Chronicles, where they go through the whole lineage again, First Chronicles, Shem, Ham, Japhet. They go in order of birth. So Shem was the oldest, Ham was the second, Japhet was the youngest. That's why I said the elder. He's the elder one. Okay, but he's Japhet's brother. Also, it mentions specifically that he is the father of all the children of Eber. Now, this is very significant because Eber would have had to be significant because really when we go down here and we study this, Eber was actually Shem's great-great-grandson. So they mention Eber. Eber is where you get the word Hebrew. Hebrew comes from Eber. I find it interesting. That in Nigeria, there's a group of people called Igbo. Did you find that interesting? There's a group of people called Igbo. And in Nigeria, there's always fights against Igbo. It's funny. I met a Nigerian brother, I think it was a year ago. We worked together on a project. And I knew he was Nigerian by his name. There's a certain type, if y'all know what I'm talking about, there's a name, like there's a way that Nigerians name their children that you could just distinguish it from all the other nations. It's different. And there's a look to the Nigerians, if you really pay attention, that's different from the other people of Africa. Right. And in Nigeria, I think the biggest tribe is Fulani. They might have Yoruba, but then there's a smaller tribe called Igbo. Right. So I was talking to a brother and he was Yoruba. In fact, I said to him, I said, "You're from Nigeria," based on his name. I said, "You're from Nigeria." He said, "How did you know that?" I said, "I could tell by your name." He said, and then I said, I did my DNA test and I have a large part of my family from Nigeria. And he said, let me guess. He said, "You're Igbo, right?" He said that. I said, "How do you know that?" He said, "The Igbos, they kind of forceful. They kind of take charge. They kind of pushy." He said, "Y'all warlike. Y'all always think you'll run everything." And I thought it was just a Jamaican thing. He said, "No, that's an Igbo." I said, "Well, it just so happens." I said, my bloodline is mostly Igbo." He said, "Yeah, I could tell." But you see, I don't know. I don't think that that's coincidental that it sounds a lot like Eber. Right? It sounds a lot like Igbo. I just say Igbo, and they say, "No, you don't say it that way." They say it's Igbo. I said, "Oh, okay. What do I know?" So, yeah. But Igbo or Eber is where you get the term Hebrew. Hebrew. And so from Eber came the lineage of Hebrews. Why would Moses mention that? Because the chosen line came out of the Hebrews. Okay. Now, not all Hebrews are the chosen line. I'm going to show you that in a second. Not all Hebrews are the chosen line. Not all. But they all do get a blessing. Praise the Most High, because he's faithful like that. But let's take a look. Genesis chapter 10. I'm going to start at verse 21 and let's read down to Eber, where he had his children. Okay. This is Genesis chapter 10, beginning at verse 21 and going down to verse 25. Unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japhet, the elder, even to him were children born. And the children of Shem, Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. And the children of Aram, Uz, Ul, Gathar, and Mash. And Arphaxad begot Salah, and Salah begot Eber. So Arphaxad is one of the children of Shem. So that's Shem's son. Then Shem's son Arphaxad had a son, and his son was called Salah. That is Shem's grandson. Then Shem's great-grandson, Salah's son, is called Eber. So Eber is the great-grandson of Shem. Okay. Let's keep reading. We're reading about our family. Y'all know that, right? We're reading about our family. We done read about Japhet's family. We read about Ham's family. Now we're reading about our family. Right here. This is where you come from. This is who you are. Okay, this is where you come from. Praise the Most High. Okay. Verse 25. And unto Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Now, this is interesting. This is the only place in the Bible that I can remember where a Spanish name is given. Peleg means divided. Another term in the Bible used for Peleg, listen here, is Perez. Yeah, Perez. You see Perez and Peleg is kind of interchangeable. They both mean divided. Perez, Peleg. Isn't that interesting? So Perez is that's the only Spanish sounding name that I have found in the Bible. Perez. Isn't that interesting? That is. I just found it interesting. So now you had Joktan, and so they're going to go through Joktan's family. Now, let me just explain this before we continue. So Joktan, all of his children and him are Hebrew. Okay? So all of Joktan's children are Hebrew. None of them go to Abraham. Perez's children go to Abraham, but Joktan's children do not. So Joktan is a Hebrew, but he's not related to, he's not Abraham's children. He's related, but he's not Abraham's children. And now we are called, what are we? We are Hebrew Israelites. Why? Because we are descendants of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. Jacob was a Hebrew. So because we come from Jacob, we are also Hebrews. But not just Hebrews, the chosen line is Hebrew Israelites, which is why even though Edom or Adam is a Hebrew, Adam is a Hebrew, but he's not a Hebrew Israelite. Does that make sense? So you have two lines here, and it divides more than that, because you see here, Joktan begot Almodad, verse 26, and Shalaf, and Hazarmawaph, and Yarah, and Adoram, and Uzal, and Diklah, and Obal, and Abimaal, and Sheba, and Ophir, and Avilah, and Zobab, Yabab, these were the sons of Joktan. So Joktan's children are Hebrews, but it was Peleg's children where you get the chosen seed. So you have Hebrews that are not of the chosen seed. I guess that's my point. You have Hebrews that are not of Hebrew Israelite origin, but they're still Hebrews. Isn't that interesting? And their dwelling, look, it's going to tell you where they settled. Verse 30. And their dwelling was in Mesha, as thou goest to Saphar, and a mount in the east. And these are the sons of Shem after their families, after their tongues, in their lands, after their nations. These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations, in their nations. By these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So there you have all the nations. So you have Hebrews that are not Hebrew Israelites. You can have a Hebrew that's not directly from Abraham. They could be from Joktan. Does that make sense? Or Yaktan or Yakatan. Ooh, that's interesting. Yakatan. What does that sound like? Yucatan Peninsula? Anyway, you have Hebrews that are not necessarily from Abraham. Okay? They could be Hebrews. And they use this term here, Saphar. Okay? Saphar in the east. Just so happened that Sephardim came from the east. So Sephardim could very well be of Hebrew origin, but they're not Hebrew Israelites. Y'all got me on that one? I know it can be confusing. But notice it said Saphar in verse 30. So you could get Sephardim from there, and they could even be Hebrews, but they're not Hebrew Israelites because they don't come from Jacob or Abraham. Okay? They came from Yakatan. Yakatan. Who is a Hebrew? See that? See, we're breaking it down to even the most finest parts just from looking at the Bible. You see what I'm saying? We're breaking it down into the finest little things, and we can even now pinpoint who we are because we were in slavery, as the Bible said we would be. Scattered nation into other nations. We look like Ham, but we're not Ham. We settled in Ham's land as our fathers did, and we were taken into slavery from the Hamites, sold to the children of Japhet, just like Joel told us we would be. And we're awakening as former slaves. Former slaves. Because the Hebrew Israelites have been enslaved or oppressed by the Egyptians, right? Followed by Hamites in the Babylon, the Greeks, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, and finally the Romans. Hebrew Israelites have been placed under bondage from all of these places. And we are them. This is us. Praise the Most High. And so we know now there are Hamites, there are other Hebrews that are not of Jacob, like Sephar. See? There you go. Praise the Most High. See how much we learn from just looking at the Bible? We looked up Sephardim. We got Sephar here. In the east, that's where they came from. Okay? That's where they came from. The Assyrians came from the east, the northeast, into the 10 tribes and took what is now Iran, and Iraq were Babylon and the Sephardim and the Assyrians. That was originally Iran and Iraq. It was taken over by the children of Japhet. There you go. Praise the Most High. Now, when we get to chapter 11, I'm going to give you all some homework. Are you ready? I'm going to give you some homework for those of you that want to do it, obviously. But this homework, now, Noah lived 350 years after the flood. Okay? So he was 600 years old when the flood came. He died at 950. He was on the ship for a year. So 349 years after they landed on Mount Ararat, he lived 349 years. Okay? Now, in chapter 11, you're going to see the lineage from Arphaxad and Shem all the way to Abraham. And I'm going to tell you right now, Noah was alive all the way to when Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan. Noah was alive. How do I know that? Well, what I did is I started at verse 10 of chapter 11 of Genesis. And all you got to do is add up. For example, you add up these numbers. So you say Shem was 100 years old, and Shem begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. Okay, so Shem was 102 years old when he had Arphaxad. He was 102. So you have 2 years after the flood right there. So you have 2. And then it says, and Shem lived after he begot Arphaxad 500 years. Then you go to verse 12. Arphaxad lived 30 and 5 years and begot Salah. So Arphaxad was 35 years old when he begot Salah. So now you got 2 and you got 35. That's 37. You keep doing that all the way till you get to Abraham. And you will not get 349 years. You will not get 349 years. You won't even get 300 years. You'll get 300 years once Abraham at age 75 leaves there to go to the land of Canaan. That's where you start getting into 300. So Noah was alive all the way till Abraham was called to go to the land of Canaan. And remember, it was Noah that said, Canaan's going to be Shem's servant. What that means, brethren, when it says Canaan shall be his servant, that means that Canaan's land was going to be taken from him and given to Shem. And then that the children of Japheth would take that land from the children of Shem and try to dwell in their place, which is what we have seen. Okay, so Noah gave that prophecy. So when Abraham is being called to go to Canaan, Noah completely understood what was going on. So I want you, here's your homework. Add up the years. Add up the years from when Shem got Arphaxad 2 years after the flood to all the way to when Abraham leaves Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan at the command of the Father. And then find me how many years you got. And I'm going to tell you right now, it's not going to be 349 years. Okay, which tells you Noah was still alive when Abraham was called to go to the land of Canaan. The Shemite going to the land of Canaan, Noah was still alive. Isn't that amazing? That's amazing, isn't it? Praise the Most High. Okay, just like Abraham, when he became Abraham, he was alive for the first 15 years of the lives of Adam and Jacob. Abraham was there with them. Isn't that amazing? Yep. Yes, he was. Praise the Most High. All right. Well, brethren, haven't we learned a lot today from this book? Hasn't this book taught us a lot today? Hasn't it given us things that no persons on the earth could give us but this book, brethren? Praise the Most High. Praise the Most High. All we had to do was read that book. We didn't have to read any other book. We just studied it. We found a Sephardim in that book. There's no more mystery of who the Sephardim is, are they? They're converts to Judaism. They're Hebrews, but they're not Hebrew Israelites. So you can have Hebrews and they not be Hebrew Israelites. You can have Shemites and they're not Hebrew Israelites. They're not even Hebrew. Only those from Eber are Hebrew. Arphaxad was the first one. But you remember, Shem had how many sons? 5. So they were all Shemites, but not all Hebrews. And then Eber had children. He had 2 children, Joktan and Peleg. From Peleg, you get Abraham. And then you get from Abraham, Israelites from Jacob. So all of Joktan's or Yakatan's children are not, they're Hebrews, but they're not Israelites. Praise the Most High. See? Abraham was around when, Esau and Jacob were born. Abraham was still alive. When Esau and Jacob were born, in fact, Hebrews 11 tells you he was as well. He said he dwelt in the tents with them, but he was alive for their first 15 years. Abraham died when those boys were 15 years old. So they knew Abraham. They knew him. They knew who their great granddaddy was. right? They knew who their great granddaddy was. Praise the Most High. Praise the Most High. Because Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob. So actually, it was their granddaddy. He was their granddaddy, not their great granddaddy. He was their granddaddy. Yeah. Yeah. And he was alive when those who were born. Just like now, I'm telling you, study for yourself, chapter 11, that Noah was alive when Abraham was called to go to Canaan. And Noah had given the prophecy that you're going to dwell in, you're going to take over Canaan. Canaan's going to be your servant. Noah was given the prophecy. That's why Abraham's father started to go to Canaan. If you recall, we read this yesterday. Abraham's father started to go on his way to Canaan, and he stopped at Ur the Chaldees and didn't go any further because he was happy there, and he died there. And then the father Yah said, Abraham, you leave and go to Canaan. And he did, because everybody knew from the lineage from Shem and from Eber that they were supposed to get Canaan based on their great granddaddy Noah's prophecy. See, praise the Most High. See how this all comes together strictly by looking at this book. See that? See that? See how we saw how Nimrod was bearing the power of Babel? We can see that right there in the book. It's right there for us to read. Praise the Most High. All we have to do is study it. Okay, for ourselves. That's why I say read your Bible for yourself. Ask your Heavenly Father for His perfect spirit to guide you in the way you should go, and He will. He will. Just let Him teach you, and He will teach you. Praise the Most High. All right, brethren. So we're going to continue in this fascinating study, and we're going to see chapter 11 of Genesis next time. But your homework is, how many years was it between when they got off the boat and when Noah died? It was 350 years, but where were they? You can see that. Prove to me where they were, because I'm telling you, Abraham was called, and Noah was still alive. Okay, so we'll see. Praise the Most High Yah for His word. Praise Him for the truth. Praise Him for the prophecies that He gives us. It's the prophecies of the Bible that distinguish this book from any other book on the planet. There is no book that has the amount of prophecies this book has, and all 100% accurate with no mistakes. This book, praise the Most High. And so as we're guided by the Father in this book, He will guide us in understanding about what's getting ready to happen, what has happened in the past, who we really are from the past, and where we're going. He tells us that. Praise the Most High. May the Most High bless you and keep you. May He cause His face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May He lift up His countenance unto you and give you peace. Shalom, family.